The sun beats down on eastern Alabama, baking the rusted armor of thousands of M1 Abrams tanks. It is late August 1991. Just months ago, these steel beasts were the undisputed vanguard of the United States military, rumbling across deserts and defining global power. Today, they sit silent in a field of tall grass, their 120mm gun barrels pointing blindly at an empty sky. A lone mechanic wipes grease from his hands, staring out at a sea of obsolete armor that stretches to the horizon. At its zenith, the Anniston Army Depot was the roaring forge of the free world. Over 7,000 workers labored around the clock, overhauling 1,200 combat vehicles a year, fueled by a multi-billion-dollar defense budget designed to outpace the Soviet Union. It was a thriving city of thunderous engines and toxic chemicals, built on the promise of perpetual readiness. But when the Cold War abruptly ended, the great engine of production seized. The empire collapsed inward. Thousands of tanks were shipped back to Alabama, not to be deployed, but to be discarded. The triumphant roar of industry was replaced by the hollow, grinding screech of metal being torn apart for scrap. How does a superpower spend billions to build the ultimate arsenal, only to turn its most vital factory into an industrial slaughterhouse for its own creations? And what happens to the men and women who spent generations building weapons for a war that suddenly vanished? Welcome to the Anniston Army Depot. This is the story of America's tank graveyard, a stark monument to the rise of the military-industrial complex and the devastating toxic cost of a sudden peace. In the early days of 1941, the rolling foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Alabama were defined by quiet agrarian rhythms. The city of Anniston and its surrounding lands were still bearing the lingering scars of the Great Depression. Cotton fields stretched across the red clay, and the local economy moved at the slow, deliberate pace of a southern farming community. But across the Atlantic, Europe was tearing itself apart in the early throes of the Second World War. The United States, officially neutral but heavily anticipating its inevitable entry into the conflict, recognized a terrifying deficit. It lacked the industrial capacity to arm a multi-front global war. The War Department needed a massive, secure facility to store, maintain, and eventually produce the immense volume of munitions required for the looming fight. It needed to be inland, safe from coastal bombardment, and connected to major railway arteries. In October 1941, the federal government set its sights on a vast tract of land just west of Anniston. Almost overnight, the quiet agricultural life of the region was shattered by the deafening roar of bulldozers and the sharp crack of dynamite. The War Department acquired over 15,000 acres of land, displacing generations of farming families to make way for what would become the Anniston Army Ordnance Depot. The transformation was not just rapid, it was a violent upheaval of the landscape. Mountains of red earth were moved to construct an intricate network of rail yards, administrative buildings, and maintenance shops. But the most defining feature of the new installation was its storage capacity. Deep within the earth, engineers constructed hundreds of reinforced concrete igloos, massive blast-proof bunkers designed to house highly volatile artillery shells, bombs, and small arms ammunition. The construction effort required an army of its own. Thousands of laborers, carpenters, and engineers poured into the region, transforming Anniston from a sleepy southern town into a booming hub of military-industrial activity. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, when ils s'appelaient crise de mai 3B, the urgency at Anniston reached a fever pitch. The depot officially opened, and the local populace, many of whom had never worked outside of a farm or a small textile mill, suddenly found themselves on the front lines of the American war effort. Men and women by the thousands clocked into the sprawling complex. They traded plows for wrenches, and cotton sacks for heavy artillery casings. The work was grueling, relentless, and extraordinarily dangerous. Workers handled millions of pounds of high explosives, packing, shipping, and maintaining the lifeblood of the Allied war machine. The economic impact on the surrounding community was profound and instantaneous. The federal government poured millions of dollars into the local economy, erecting housing projects, paving roads, and laying down infrastructure at a pace never before seen in the state. Paychecks from the depot lifted thousands of families out of poverty. Main Street in Anniston buzzed with newfound prosperity. Diners were full, shops were thriving, and the local tax base swelled. The depot became the undisputed economic engine of the region, an artificial heart pumping federal dollars into a previously impoverished community. Yet beneath this sudden wave of prosperity lay a deeply unsettling reality, one that would define the region for the next century. The town of Anniston had essentially entered into a Faustian bargain with the United States military. Their newfound wealth, their job security, and their entire way of life were now inextricably linked to the business of death and destruction. The community's economic heartbeat was synchronized with the thunder of artillery on foreign shores. If the guns stopped firing, the money would stop flowing. As the Second World War raged on, the depot expanded its operations beyond mere storage. It began to take on the complex maintenance and repair of combat vehicles, laying the groundwork for its future legacy. Trains miles long snaked out of the facility, carrying the heavy armor and high explosives that would supply troops in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. The workers of Anniston took immense pride in their contribution to the war effort, viewing themselves as essential cogs in the great machine that was dismantling fascism overseas. By the time the Axis powers surrendered in 1945, the Anniston Army Depot had fundamentally altered the DNA of eastern Alabama. The land was permanently scarred by concrete bunkers and industrial waste, and the people were permanently bound to the Department of Defense. They had survived the Great Depression and helped win a world war, but they had also unwittingly trapped themselves in a perilous cycle. They were no longer just a community in Alabama. They were a heavily militarized company town. And as the dust settled on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, a new, much colder, and far more terrifying conflict was already brewing on the horizon, one that would push the forges of Anniston to their absolute breaking point. The dust of the Second World War had barely settled when a new, invisible curtain fell across Europe. The Soviet Union, once a vital ally, rapidly transformed into an existential threat. The United States military realized that demobilization was a luxury it could no longer afford. The brief lull in production at the Anniston Army Depot vanished almost overnight with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Soon after, the escalating tensions of the Cold War cemented the facility's status as a permanent, critical pillar of the American defense establishment. The forge was reignited, but this time the fire would burn for 4 uninterrupted decades. Anniston was designated as a primary combat vehicle rebuild center. As the arms race accelerated, the nature of warfare shifted toward heavy mechanized infantry, and the depot's mandate grew exponentially. It was no longer just about storing ammunition. It was about mastering the complex anatomy of the American tank. The sprawling complex of maintenance shops expanded into a labyrinth of heavy machinery, hydraulic presses, and specialized assembly lines. By the 1960s and 1970s, Anniston was overhauling the M48 and M60 Patton tanks, breaking down battle-weary behemoths into thousands of individual parts, stripping away the rust and battle damage, and rebuilding them to factory-new specifications. They were churning out the armored muscle that stared down Soviet forces across the Fulda Gap. The financial influx during this era was staggering. The Department of Defense pumped billions of dollars into the facility. For the local community, This translated into an unprecedented era of blue-collar prosperity. Working at the depot became a generational inheritance. It was not uncommon to find grandfathers, fathers, and sons working side by side on the same shop floor. The federal paychecks provided a ticket to the middle class: new homes in sprawling subdivisions, multiple cars in the driveway, and college tuitions paid in full. Anniston became a fortress of economic stability, insulated from the cyclical recessions that battered other manufacturing towns. The local economy was inextricably tethered to the relentless drumbeat of the military-industrial complex. As long as the Soviet bear growled in the east, the engines in Alabama would roar. But this golden age of production harbored a terrifying dark side. The insatiable appetite of the Cold War demanded more than just conventional steel. It demanded weapons of mass destruction. In the early 1960s, the Anniston Army Depot was selected as one of the primary storage sites for the nation's rapidly expanding chemical weapons stockpile. Deep within the very same concrete igloos built during World War II, the military began stockpiling thousands of tons of deadly chemical agents including sarin, VX nerve gas, and mustard agent. These were not abstract threats. They were physical, volatile liquids and gases stored in aging artillery shells and landmines, sitting mere miles from neighborhoods, schools, and downtown businesses. 7% of the entire United States chemical weapons arsenal was quietly tucked beneath the Alabama red clay. The town of Anniston had quietly become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The workforce and the community accepted this harrowing reality with a stoic, unspoken resilience. It was the ultimate pact, guaranteed prosperity in exchange for living in the shadow of a localized apocalypse. Evacuation sirens were installed across the county. School children practiced emergency drills, learning how to seal windows with duct tape in the event of a chemical leak. The people of Anniston learned to compartmentalize the terror, drowning out the anxiety with the deafening hum of the tank assembly lines. The money was simply too good, the patriotism too ingrained, and the perceived threat of the Soviet Union too immense to question the wisdom of storing nerve gas in their own backyard. By the 1980s, as the Reagan administration initiated a massive military buildup, Anniston reached the absolute zenith of its operational power. The facility was tasked with maintaining the military's newest and most lethal creation, the M1 Abrams main battle tank. The Abrams was a technological marvel, a 68-ton beast powered by a turbine engine, and overhauling it required a highly specialized, highly trained workforce. Anniston adapted seamlessly, pouring millions into new facilities and training programs. Employment numbers soared past 7,000. The depot was overhauling over 1,000 combat vehicles a year, operating on a relentless, high-octane cycle. To the men and women clocking in every day, the machine felt invincible. They were the undisputed champions of heavy armor, the silent warriors ensuring American supremacy on the global stage. The prevailing belief was that the Cold War was a permanent state of human existence. The contracts would never end, the defense budgets would only grow, and the tanks would always need repairing. They had built an entire ecosystem, an entire culture around the preparation for World War III. They could not have known that thousands of miles away the Soviet economy was quietly suffocating under the weight of this exact same arms race. They could not have anticipated that the great ideological conflict defining their lives was not going to end in a blaze of nuclear fire, but in a sudden, anticlimactic whisper. And they certainly could not have foreseen that the greatest threat to their livelihoods was not the Red Army, but the devastating, unprecedented arrival of global peace. For 40 years, the Anniston Army Depot operated on a singular, unwavering premise. The Soviet Union was an existential threat that could only be held at bay by overwhelming American armor. Every rivet driven, every turbine calibrated, and every trackpad replaced was a calculated move on a global chessboard. The workers in eastern Alabama did not merely build and repair machinery, they manufactured deterrence. Their entire socioeconomic reality was predicated on the promise of a war that was always just over the horizon. But history rarely unfolds according to the meticulous blueprints of military planners. The first tremors of the earthquake were not felt on a battlefield, but broadcast through television screens. In November 1989, the workers of Anniston watched in stunned silence as the Berlin Wall, the physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain, was torn down by jubilant crowds. For the rest of the world, it was a moment of profound liberation and triumph. But inside the heavy maintenance shops of the depot, the footage evoked a complex, unsettling cognitive dissonance. The men and women wiping grease from their hands realized that the barrier dividing the world was crumbling, and with it, the foundational justification for their daily labor. By December 1991, the unthinkable became official reality. The Soviet Union formally dissolved. The Great Red Bear, the terrifying adversary that had driven 4 decades of unprecedented defense spending, simply collapsed under the weight of its own economic contradictions. The Cold War was over. America had won. In Washington, D.C., politicians and economists rapidly pivoted to a new buzzword: the peace dividend. The logic was brutally straightforward. Without a superpower rival to counter, the United States no longer needed to maintain a massive, hyperinflated standing army. The defense budget, which had swollen to historic proportions during the 1980s buildup, was immediately targeted for drastic reductions. Billions of dollars earmarked for weapons procurement, vehicle overhauls, and base operations were suddenly frozen, redirected, or erased entirely from the federal ledger. For the Anniston Army Depot, the peace dividend was not a political victory. It was an industrial death sentence. Almost overnight, the frantic, relentless pace of the factory floor slammed into a bureaucratic wall. The Department of Defense issued sweeping directives to halt or severely scale back existing contracts. The military no longer needed 1,000 combat vehicles overhauled every year. They did not need endless lines of pristine M1 Abrams tanks ready to deploy to the Fulda Gap. The strategic calculus of the United States had shifted from global mechanized warfare to localized containment, and heavy armor was suddenly deemed an expensive, obsolete luxury. The psychological impact on the Anniston community was immediate and profound. This was a town that had been bred for conflict. Its schools, its housing markets, and its local businesses were all inextricably linked to the financial lifeblood of the depot. The workforce was composed of highly specialized technicians, welders certified in advanced armor plating, mechanics trained exclusively on turbine tank engines, and logistics experts who managed the flow of high explosives. Outside the gates of the depot, these hyper-specific skills had little to no market value in the civilian world. As the weeks turned into months following the Soviet collapse, a chilling silence began to creep into the sprawling industrial complex. Assembly lines that had once operated on mandatory overtime, deafening the floor with the sound of pneumatic tools and heavy cranes, were now powered down for days at a time. The shift whistles still blew, but the urgency had completely evaporated. Workers found themselves standing idle beside half-disassembled tanks, waiting for parts that were no longer being ordered, or instructions for contracts that had been permanently canceled. The atmosphere inside the depot transformed from patriotic fervor to suffocating anxiety. Rumors of massive impending layoffs swept through the break rooms and local diners. Families who had banked on generational employment, parents expecting their children to inherit their union jobs on the floor, suddenly realized the pipeline was closed. The Department of Defense was not just trimming the fat, it was fundamentally restructuring the entire military-industrial base. The tragedy of Anniston's predicament was deeply ironic. The workforce had executed their mission flawlessly. They had built an arsenal so intimidating, so technologically superior, that their enemy chose economic ruin over a direct confrontation. The workers of Alabama had helped win the Cold War without firing a single shot, yet their reward for this historic victory was the immediate obsolescence of their livelihoods. They were victims of their own spectacular success. Management at the depot desperately tried to pivot, pitching the facility as a vital center for future technological upgrades. But the math coming out of the Pentagon was unforgiving. The sheer volume of work required to sustain a workforce of over 7,000 people simply did not exist in a peacetime economy. The massive infrastructure of Anniston, the miles of rail lines, the vast maintenance bays, the thousands of specialized tools, was suddenly exposed as a colossal, expensive liability. As the reality of the peace dividends settled over the red clay of Alabama, a new, entirely different logistical nightmare was brewing across the Atlantic. The United States military was fundamentally downsizing its footprint in Europe. Bases in Germany were being shuttered, armored divisions were being deactivated, and the Pentagon faced a monumental question: what to do with the thousands of heavy combat vehicles currently sitting on foreign soil, vehicles that were no longer needed, too expensive to maintain and politically impossible to abandon? The answer would soon arrive at the gates of Anniston, not in the form of lucrative repair contracts, but as a relentless, overwhelming tide of obsolete steel. The depot was about to transition from being the birthplace of American armor to its final, rusting purgatory. The forges were going cold, and the gravediggers were preparing for a harvest unlike anything the world had ever seen. For decades, the railway lines leading out of the Anniston Army Depot had been the mighty arteries of American power projection. Flatbed train cars laden with freshly overhauled armor would rumble out of the Alabama hills, bound for deep-water ports, eventually crossing the oceans to fortify the borders of West Germany or the sands of the Middle East. It was a one-way street of industrial might, a continuous outward flow of pristine steel. But in the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rhythmic clatter of those tracks underwent a profound, unsettling reversal. The trains were no longer leaving. They were coming back. The catalyst for this unprecedented logistical undertaking was twofold. First came the signing of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe in late 1990. As the Cold War thawed, NATO and the disintegrating Warsaw Pact agreed to drastically reduce their massive arsenals of tanks, artillery, and armored combat vehicles. The United States committed to withdrawing thousands of heavy weapons from the European theater. Shortly after, the swift and decisive conclusion of Operation Desert Storm in 1991 left the American military with a sprawling surplus of armor in the Persian Gulf. The Department of Defense looked at its global footprint and realized it possessed an armada of heavy mechanized units that it simply no longer needed and could no longer afford to maintain. The order was given to bring the iron home. But bringing home tens of thousands of 60-ton war machines is not a matter of simply parking them in a garage. They required a massive, secure facility with the specialized rail infrastructure capable of receiving, offloading, and storing a volume of heavy armor the world had not seen demobilized since 1945. Anniston, with its vast acreage and historical pedigree as the Army's premier tank facility, was the inevitable destination. The arrival began as a trickle and quickly escalated into a relentless, mechanized flood. Day after day, week after week, mile-long trains snaked their way into the depot. The cargo was a staggering visual history of late 20th century warfare. There were fleets of M60 Patton tanks, coated in the fading woodland camouflage of the European theater, obsolete now in the age of the turbine engine. Behind them came early model M1 Abrams and M113 armored personnel carriers, their desert tan paint chipped and scored by the abrasive sands of Iraq and Kuwait. For the veteran workers of Anniston, standing on the receiving docks, the sight was profoundly disorienting. These men and women were accustomed to receiving battered vehicles, assessing their damage, and routing them directly into the roaring maintenance bays to be resurrected. That was the established rhythm of their professional lives. But as the trains screeched to a halt, the routing orders were entirely different. These machines were not being scheduled for the assembly lines. There were no overhaul contracts attached to their chassis. There was no funding allocated to bring them back to factory specifications. Instead, heavy cranes and transport crews unloaded the vehicles and drove them away from the concrete industrial complex, steering them out toward the sprawling, open fields on the periphery of the installation. They were driving them into the grass. The great reversal had begun. The forge was shutting down, and Anniston was officially opening its doors as the largest military mortuary in the United States. The physical transformation of the Anniston Army Depot over the early 1990s was staggering in its scale and deeply melancholic in its execution. What the military officially designated as the Combat Vehicle Evaluation Area quickly outgrew its bureaucratic title. It became simply and ominously the boneyard. Row upon row, column upon column, the tanks were parked wheel to wheel, track to track, stretching across hundreds of acres of Alabama red clay. The sheer accumulation of mass defied comprehension. It was a sea of olive drab and desert sand, an armored armada landlocked in the deep south. From the air, it looked as though a massive, invading army had simply stopped in its tracks, powered down its engines, and vanished. The psychological weight of this growing metallic graveyard pressed heavily on the workforce that remained inside the depot's increasingly quiet maintenance shops. Every time a mechanic or a logistics officer looked out the window or drove past the perimeter fence, they were confronted with a jarring visual paradox. Out there, baking in the relentless southern sun, sat billions of dollars of taxpayer investment. These were the pinnacle achievements of American engineering, machines that possessed the firepower to level cities and the armor to withstand direct artillery hits. Yet here they were, defeated not by an enemy force, but by the stroke of a pen on a peace treaty and a shift in a federal budget. As the years crept on, nature began its slow, inevitable reclamation of the steel. The punishing humidity of Alabama gnawed at the exposed metal, blooming into patches of bright orange rust. Tall weeds and wild grass wove their way through the heavy treads and tangled around the dormant road wheels. The internal fluids, hydraulic oil, diesel fuel, and heavy lubricants began to seep, requiring constant, tedious environmental monitoring by a skeleton crew of workers tasked with preventing the chemical lifeblood of the tanks from poisoning the soil. The silence of the boneyard was perhaps its most haunting attribute. These were machines designed to roar at 95 decibels, to shake the earth beneath their tracks, and to fire main guns that could shatter the eardrums of anyone standing too close. Now they sat in absolute eerie stillness. The 105mm and 120mm gun barrels, once calibrated to hit moving targets miles away, were locked into fixed positions, pointing blindly at the empty horizon like gravestones in a vast industrial cemetery. For the community of Anniston, the iron corpses served as a grim daily reminder of their precarious new reality. The fields of rotting tanks were a monument to the fleeting, transactional nature of the military-industrial complex. The government had demanded their absolute dedication, their sweat, and their unwavering labor for 4 decades to build this very mountain of steel. And now that the geopolitical winds had shifted, that mountain was simply discarded in their backyard, a colossal rusting anchor dragging the local economy down with it. Yet as devastating as the economic stagnation and the visual blight of the graveyard were, an even more insidious threat had been silently brewing beneath the surface of Anniston for half a century. The true cost of victory was not just measured in obsolete tanks and lost jobs. It was measured in the soil, the water, and the blood of the people who had kept the machine running. The visual decay of the tank graveyard was a glaring testament to the end of an era, a sprawling monument of rusted steel baking under the Alabama sun. But the true cost of Anniston's 4-decade reign as the premier forge of American armor was not written in obsolete metal. It was written in the soil, the groundwater, and the bloodstreams of the people who lived in its shadow. While the nation celebrated the bloodless victory of the Cold War, the community surrounding the Anniston Army Depot slowly realized that a very real, very lethal war had been waged against their own environment. For half a century, the overhaul of heavy combat vehicles had been a violently messy business. To strip a 60-ton battle tank down to its bare chassis required an ocean of harsh chemical agents. Workers in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, operating in an era before stringent environmental protections or modern safety gear, routinely utilized powerful industrial solvents, degreasers, and caustic acids. Millions of gallons of trichloroethylene, TCE, and other volatile organic compounds were used to blast decades of baked-on grease, desert sand, and carbon from massive turbine engines and transmission blocks. Once these chemicals had served their purpose, they had to go somewhere. For decades, the toxic runoff, heavily laced with lead, chromium, and carcinogenic solvents, was channeled into unlined industrial trenches, open disposal pits, and local waterways. The toxic slurry seeped deep into the porous red clay, migrating silently into the groundwater aquifers that fed the region. By 1989, the environmental devastation could no longer be ignored. The Environmental Protection Agency officially designated the Anniston Army Depot a Superfund site, confirming that the very earth beneath the facility was profoundly contaminated. For the generations of blue-collar workers who had built their lives around the depot, this revelation triggered a devastating cognitive dissonance. These were men and women who had viewed their labor as an act of profound patriotism. They had plunged their bare hands into vats of chemical strippers to ensure American troops had reliable armor. Initially, many in the community fiercely defended the military, dismissing the environmental reports as bureaucratic overreach. To attack the depot felt like an attack on their civic identity and their economic survival. But as the years passed, the undeniable reality of the sicknesses began to fracture that fierce loyalty. Workers were forced to watch their former colleagues and neighbors fall victim to rare cancers, respiratory failures, and severe neurological disorders. The ultimate bitter irony of the Anniston economy became inescapable. The military installation that provided their livelihoods, their middle-class homes, and their health insurance was the exact same entity responsible for making them chronically ill. Yet the industrial runoff was only half of Anniston's toxic nightmare. The community also had to reckon with the terrifying legacy of the Cold War's darkest contingency plan. Hidden away in the depot's reinforced concrete igloos lay 2,254 tons of chemical weapons, artillery shells, rockets, and landmines loaded with mustard gas, sarin, and VX nerve agent, some of the most lethal substances ever engineered by human hands, had been quietly aging in their backyards since the 1960s. As the global political landscape shifted and international treaties, specifically the Chemical Weapons Convention, mandated the total destruction of these stockpiles, the military faced a monumental logistical hurdle. The munitions were deemed too old, too volatile, and too dangerous to transport across state lines to remote disposal facilities. The Pentagon's solution was brutally pragmatic. The weapons would have to be destroyed exactly where they sat. To accomplish this, the military constructed the Anniston Chemical Activity Incinerator, a massive, towering facility designed to burn the lethal agents right on the depot's grounds. When the incinerator fired up in the early 2000s, it cast a long, psychological shadow over the entire region. The community of Anniston, already grappling with the economic shock of the peace dividend and the groundwater contamination, was now forced to live in a state of perpetual low-grade terror. The margin for error was non-existent. A single micro-leak of VX nerve agent could obliterate the surrounding neighborhoods in minutes. The federal government attempted to mitigate the panic through a surreal emergency preparedness campaign. Protective hoods and positive pressure respirators were distributed to local residents. Schools were outfitted with specialized air filtration systems and heavy plastic sheeting. Teachers were trained to tape doors shut and administer auto-injectors of atropine, an antidote for nerve gas exposure, to their students in the event of an alarm. For the children growing up in the shadow of the incinerator's towering smokestack, the drills were a normalized, terrifying part of their curriculum. They were the civilian collateral damage of a global standoff they barely understood. This environmental and psychological burden did not fall equally. The neighborhoods situated closest to the depot's perimeter, primarily in West Anniston, were largely working-class and minority communities. They bore the absolute brunt of the airborne emissions, the contaminated well water, and the deafening test sirens that routinely shattered the quiet of the night. Property values in the immediate vicinity plummeted to zero, effectively trapping families in a designated toxic zone with no financial means of escape. The toxic legacy of the Anniston Army Depot stripped away the glamorous, patriotic veneer of the military-industrial complex. It revealed the cold, calculated arithmetic of national defense. To project power abroad, certain communities at home were quietly designated as sacrifice zones. The people of Anniston had held up their end of the Faustian bargain, providing the sweat and the steel that won the Cold War. But as the defense contracts dried up and the tanks were left to rot in the fields, the military's slow withdrawal laid bare the true cost of their prosperity. The enemy had never fired a single missile at Alabama, but the land had been deeply, irreparably poisoned just the same. By the mid-1990s, the Anniston Army Depot was caught in a brutal logistical paradox. The peace dividend had slashed their operational budget to a fraction of its former glory, and the massive production lines that once churned out pristine armor by the thousands were largely silent. Yet the United States military had not completely disbanded. It still maintained active armored divisions across the globe, and those units still required critical maintenance. The problem was supply. The Pentagon, focused on extreme cost-cutting, was no longer issuing lucrative contracts to manufacture thousands of new replacement parts for legacy vehicles. The endless pipeline of factory-fresh components that defined the Cold War had been abruptly severed. To keep the remaining active fleet operational, the depot had to find a new source for engines, transmissions, torsion bars, and optics. They found it sitting right in their own backyard. The sprawling tank graveyard, originally intended as a final, passive resting place for obsolete armor, was abruptly reclassified. It was no longer just a purgatory of rusting steel. It became an active, industrial-scale organ donor program. The military command referred to this process with a sterilized, bureaucratic term, reclamation. But to the workers on the ground in the Alabama dirt, the practice was known by a much darker, far more accurate name. It was cannibalization. This new directive fundamentally altered the physical reality of work at Anniston. Instead of standing at well-lit, highly organized assembly stations receiving clean, newly machined components from federal defense contractors, teams of mechanics were now dispatched outward. They were sent into the overgrown, sun-baked fields of the boneyard. Their mission was to hunt down specific models among the thousands of rotting hulls, crack them open, and surgically extract whatever viable components still remained intact. It was a grueling, primitive form of industrial scavenging that felt entirely foreign to a workforce trained in precision overhauls. The physical conditions of the cannibalization protocol were notoriously punishing. The boneyard offered no shade, no climate control, and no heavy overhead cranes to assist with the immense weight of the armored parts. During the blistering Alabama summers, the steel hulls of the M60 Pattons and early M1 Abrams essentially became massive, rusted ovens. Temperatures inside the cramped crew compartments routinely exceeded 130 degrees. Mechanics had to wedge their bodies into these suffocating dark spaces, armed only with hand tools and portable generators, fighting against decades of seized bolts, hardened grease, and deep-set corrosion. The environment was not only physically exhausting, it was fundamentally hostile. The tall wild grass surrounding the dormant tanks had become a thriving habitat for the local wildlife. Workers frequently encountered venomous copperhead snakes, fire ant colonies, and black widow spiders nesting within the heavy treads and hollow engine bays. Every extraction was a battle against nature and decay. A team of 4 men might spend 3 agonizing days wrestling a 2-ton transmission block out of a rusted chassis, using portable chain hoists, crowbars, and sheer brute force, only to haul it back to the shop and discover that the internal gears had already been compromised by years of undetected water damage. When that happened, the entire brutal effort was rendered entirely worthless, and the team had to march back out into the grass to find another corpse. Beyond the blistering heat and the physical toll, the cannibalization protocol inflicted a deep, lingering psychological wound on the workforce. For generations, the identity of the Anniston worker had been defined by creation, renewal, and a profound sense of patriotic duty. They were the master craftsmen of the American military, the proud builders of the arsenal of democracy. They had taken raw steel and forged it into an unstoppable projection of global power. Now their daily routine was defined exclusively by destruction and decay. They had been reduced to the role of scavengers, picking the meat off the bones of their own magnificent creations. The bitter irony of the work was inescapable on the shop floor. A veteran mechanic might be sent out into the field to strip a laser rangefinder or a firing module from an old M113 personnel carrier, only to wipe away the grime and recognize a specific weld mark, or find his own inspector's stamp on the hull. He was tearing apart the exact same vehicle he had proudly assembled 20 years earlier. The magnificent machine he had built to win the Cold War, the tank he had poured his youth and sweat into, was now just a donor corpse, sacrificed piece by piece to keep a shrinking, underfunded fleet on life support. In the eyes of its own workforce, the depot had effectively transformed from the roaring forge of the free world into a massive, state-sponsored chop shop. The hazards of the job also evolved in terrifying ways. When the tanks were originally built, the materials were fresh, stable, and the industrial hazards were at least predictable. But tearing apart a 20-year-old combat vehicle that had been left to rot in a field exposed the workers to an unpredictable, highly degraded cocktail of toxins. As they hacked through layers of peeling exterior paint, they were kicking up clouds of aerosolized lead. As they ripped out old engine compartments, they disturbed crumbling asbestos insulation. And when they dealt with the heavy armor plating of the Abrams, they risked inhaling the microscopic dust of depleted uranium. The very act of salvaging these desperate components released the toxic, physical legacy of the Cold War directly into the faces of the extraction teams. Yet despite the deep indignity, the severe physical danger, and the exhausting nature of the work, the cannibalization protocol was the only thing keeping the front gates of Anniston open. It was a grim, ugly survival mechanism in an era of massive defense cuts. The depot management, fighting for relevance in Washington, understood that if they could not provide this vital, cost-saving scavenging service to the Pentagon, the entire facility would be deemed entirely obsolete. The workers swallowed their pride and marched into the overgrown fields every single morning, armed with pry bars and heavy wrenches. They tore apart their own history piece by rusted piece, ripping the engines out of the machines that had defined their lives. They did it because the alternative was joining the swelling ranks of the unemployed in a rural Alabama town that had absolutely nothing else to offer. They were surviving the end of the world they had known, but they were doing it by eating their own dead. As the 1990s bled into the 2000s, the localized suffering at the Anniston Army Depot was suddenly eclipsed by a much larger, bureaucratic terror sweeping across the American military landscape. The Department of Defense, still aggressively chasing the financial mirage of the peace dividend, deployed its most ruthless administrative weapon, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, widely known and universally feared as BRAC. BRAC was not a scalpel designed to trim excess fat. It was a broadsword meant to sever entire limbs from the military-industrial complex. Across the United States, historic shipyards, sprawling Air Force bases, and massive logistics centers were systematically evaluated, graded, and permanently erased from the map. When an installation was placed on the BRAC closure list, the economic devastation for the surrounding community was absolute. Entire towns were turned into hollowed-out ghost cities in a matter of months. And as the BRAC committee set its sights on the Army's remaining heavy armor facilities, Anniston found itself staring directly into the abyss. The anxiety that gripped eastern Alabama during the BRAC hearings was visceral. The community had already endured the agonizing slowdown of the production lines, the environmental nightmare of the chemical incinerator, and the degrading reality of the cannibalization protocol. But the prospect of total closure was a different magnitude of disaster. Without the depot, Anniston had no economic safety net. The thousands of highly specialized mechanics, the logistical coordinators, and the hazardous material handlers would not just lose their jobs, they would lose their pensions, their health care, and the bedrock of their local economy. Local politicians, union leaders, and desperate citizens mounted a frantic defense. They journeyed to Washington, armed with binders of data, pleading the case for their survival. They argued that Anniston possessed capabilities that simply could not be replicated anywhere else. They pointed to the massive, heavily fortified igloos holding the chemical weapons stockpile, arguing that moving the toxic arsenal was an impossible risk. They highlighted their gritty willingness to perform the brutal cannibalization work that kept the active fleet running on a shoestring budget. Essentially, Anniston's defense rested on a grim reality. They had already accepted the most dangerous, degrading jobs the military had to offer, and therefore, they were indispensable. When the final BRAC recommendations were published, a collective shuddering breath was released across eastern Alabama. Anniston had survived the purge. The gates would remain open. The community celebrated the announcement as a massive victory, a validation of their decades of sacrifice. But the celebration was painfully short-lived. As the dust settled and the new operational directives were handed down, the true nature of their survival became clear. Anniston had not been saved because it was slated for a return to its former glory. It was saved because it was deemed the most efficient place to consolidate the misery. The depot was tasked with absorbing the workloads and the rusting inventories of several other facilities that had not survived the BRAC cuts. Even more obsolete tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery pieces were shipped to Alabama, swelling the already massive footprint of the boneyard. Yet the funding to manage this influx did not rise proportionately. The workforce, which had peaked during the Reagan era, had been whittled down to a fraction of that number. The men and women who remained were expected to do more with less, managing an ever-growing graveyard of steel while navigating the treacherous, toxic environment of the cannibalization fields. Surviving the purge fundamentally altered the psychology of the Anniston workforce. The proud, defiant spirit of the Cold War era was replaced by a grim, battered pragmatism. They were no longer the indispensable architects of American power. They were the weary caretakers of its ruins. The facility itself began to reflect this internal shift. The massive maintenance bays that once echoed with the deafening roar of 1,000 mechanics working in unison now felt cavernous and empty. Entire sections of the complex were shuttered, the lights turned off, and the heavy machinery covered in thick plastic tarps to prevent dust accumulation. The town of Anniston had technically won the battle against the Bracy Commission, but the victory felt remarkably like a defeat. They had escaped the sudden catastrophic death of a total shutdown, only to be condemned to a slow, agonizing process of managed decline. They were allowed to keep their jobs, but the soul of the work had been irrevocably stripped away. The great engine of war had not been turned back on. It had simply been left to idle in the dark, sputtering on the fumes of a bygone era. The physical decay of the boneyard was an arresting visual spectacle, a sprawling testament to the end of an era. But to truly understand the devastating aftermath of the Anniston Army Depot, one had to look away from the rusted steel and into the quiet, unassuming neighborhoods of eastern Alabama. The most profound and lasting legacy of the Cold War forge was not parked out in the tall grass. It was living and slowly dying in the living rooms and on the front porches of the community. These were the ghosts of the armor, the men and women who had traded their physical health for the security of a nation that ultimately left them behind. For decades, employment at the depot had been a fiercely protected family tradition. It was woven into the cultural fabric of the region. Grandfathers who had packed artillery shells during the Second World War watched their sons rebuild M60 Pattons for Vietnam, who in turn trained their own children to strip down M1 Abrams in the 1980s. This generational continuity was once a source of immense civic pride. It was a blue-collar bloodline dedicated to the defense of the free world. But as the new millennium progressed, that proud lineage morphed into a shared, terrifying medical history. The familial bond was no longer just the work. It was the onset of the exact same diseases. The toxic bill for 50 years of unregulated industrial warfare had finally come due. The solvents, degreasers, and heavy metals that had saturated the shop floors and seeped into the groundwater were now manifesting in the bodies of the workforce. It did not happen with the sudden violence of a battlefield casualty. It was a slow, insidious erosion. By the early 2000s, local doctors began noting a deeply disturbing trend among the retired depot workers. There were alarming clusters of rare blood cancers, severe peripheral neuropathy, and aggressive respiratory failures. Men who had spent their entire adult lives wrestling 2-ton engine blocks were suddenly losing the ability to grip a coffee cup. Women who had meticulously calibrated optical sensors were tethered to oxygen tanks, struggling to draw a single unassisted breath. The community became haunted by the living. A walk down Main Street or a visit to a local diner revealed the physical toll of the cannibalization yards and the chemical bays. Former mechanics, their hands permanently stained by decades of grease and industrial fluids, moved with the involuntary tremors of Parkinson's disease, a neurological nightmare strongly linked to the chronic inhalation of trichloroethylene, the very solvent they had used by the barrel to clean tank parts. They were the casualties of a war that had never officially been declared on American soil. They had absorbed the collateral damage of global deterrence directly into their lungs and their bloodstreams. The emotional tension in Anniston shifted from the acute anxiety of job loss to a profound, bitter sense of betrayal. These workers had operated under the assumption of a reciprocal social contract. They believed that by dedicating their youth, their labor, and their absolute loyalty to the Department of Defense, the government would ensure their well-being in their twilight years. Instead, as the medical diagnoses multiplied, they found themselves facing a cold, bureaucratic wall. Fighting for occupational hazard compensation or specialized medical care meant navigating a labyrinth of red tape, legal denials, and demands for impossible burdens of proof. The military-industrial complex which had meticulously tracked every single rivet and bolt of a 60-ton tank, suddenly demanded that a dying mechanic prove precisely which vat of unmarked chemicals had caused his cancer 20 years prior. This administrative abandonment cut deeper than any brat closure threat ever could. The workers realized they were being treated with the exact same cold, calculated arithmetic as the vehicles they had spent their lives building. When an M60 patent was deemed too expensive to fix, it was parked in a field and left to the elements. When the human machinery of the depot broke down, crippled by the toxic environment they were ordered to work in, they were similarly discarded, left to quietly weather their decline in the shadows of the Appalachian foothills. The tragedy of the Anniston veterans is a stark, uncomfortable truth about the mechanics of an empire. The United States spent billions to forge an impenetrable shield of armor, projecting an image of invincibility across the globe. But the human hands that hammered that shield were left entirely unprotected. Today, the ghosts of the armor sit in their quiet homes, clutching stacks of medical bills instead of medals. They watch the news, they listen to the distant, fading hum of the depot, and they bear the silent, agonizing weight of a victory that cost them everything. As the human architects of the Cold War slowly fade away, only the steel remains, silent and rotting, outlasting the very people who gave it life. Today, a drive along the perimeter fence of the Anniston Army Depot offers a surreal, unbroken glimpse into an empire frozen in time. The rolling fields of eastern Alabama remain choked with the rusting husks of thousands of combat vehicles. They sit exactly where they were parked decades ago, an immovable, landlocked ocean of olive drab and desert tan bleeding into the red clay. But the world beyond the chain-link fence has fundamentally transformed. The nature of global conflict has evolved with terrifying speed, leaving this mountain of heavy armor stranded in a bygone century. We have entered the era of asymmetrical warfare, hypersonic missiles, autonomous drone swarms, and devastating invisible cyber attacks. The United States military now invests its billions into stealth technology, artificial intelligence, and special operations commands. The very idea of massing thousands of 60-ton main battle tanks for a conventional, head-to-head ground war across open plains is now viewed by modern military strategists not as a viable tactic, but as a historical anomaly. The tanks sitting in Anniston are no longer considered a strategic reserve for a rainy day. They are a multi-billion-dollar anachronism, monuments to a type of warfare that simply no longer exists. The sheer scale of this purgatory of steel defies simple comprehension. As a drone camera sweeps high over the facility, the endless rows of M60 Pattons and early model M1 Abrams stretch far beyond the horizon, blurring into a textured, metallic landscape. Their 120mm main guns, once capable of projecting American dominance thousands of miles away, now point aimlessly toward the quiet southern sky. The camouflage paint is violently peeling, exposing the thick, hardened steel to the relentless, humid rot of the deep south. Vines and tall wild grass creep through the road wheels and wrap tightly around the drive sprockets, slowly but surely anchoring the massive machines back into the earth. There is no roar of turbine engines here. There is no grinding of heavy tracks, no shouts from mechanics, and no clatter of pneumatic tools. There is only the eerie, windswept silence of a colossal industrial graveyard. Even the brutal cannibalization protocols of the 1990s have largely ceased. The modern digitized active fleet has no use for the analog degraded components rusting inside these hulls. This is the final, unglamorous resting place of the Cold War. It is not a polished museum with bronze plaques and sweeping orchestral tributes. It is a sprawling, decaying salvage yard where the ultimate, would-it-being Charlie's most feared weapons of the 20th century go to quietly disintegrate out of sight. The tragedy of Anniston serves as a profound physical lesson in the fleeting vanity of the military-industrial complex and the hubris of unchecked industrial greed. For half a century, the United States government and the defense industry convinced a small, rural community that their relentless, highly toxic labor was the absolute bedrock of national survival. They spent billions of taxpayer dollars forging this armor, permanently poisoning the local water table, and sacrificing the physical health of 3 generations of American workers in the process. And for what ultimate purpose? So that the crown jewels of American military engineering could ultimately be driven into a grassy field, powered down, and left to rot. The boneyard represents a staggering, almost incomprehensible misallocation of human effort and national wealth. It is the physical manifestation of a paranoid defense strategy that prioritized endless, unchecked production over any concept of long-term sustainability. The tanks were built to defeat a Soviet empire that ultimately collapsed from within under the weight of its own economic failures, leaving the United States to deal with the monumental rusting hangover of its own overproduction. As the sun sets over the Appalachian foothills, casting long, jagged shadows across the thousands of dormant turrets, the Anniston Army Depot stands as a grim, silent monument to the true, hidden cost of peace. It reminds us that the colossal engines of war are incredibly easy to start, fueled by fear and limitless budgets, but almost impossible to safely and responsibly shut down. The military-industrial machine consumed the land, exploited the fierce loyalty of the local workforce, and ultimately discarded both when the geopolitical winds shifted. The men and women who built these titans are slowly fading away, carrying the toxic legacy of their labor in their failing lungs and their poisoned bloodstreams. But the iron corpses remain. They will sit in the Alabama dirt for centuries, silent, rusting sentinels guarding a purgatory of steel. They are trapped forever between the glory of their creation and the inevitability of their decay, waiting in the tall grass for a war that will never come. The story of Anniston is not merely one of rusting tanks or bureaucratic mismanagement. It is a profound meditation on the life cycle of industrial ambition. We build to protect, we produce to thrive, and we often ignore the mounting costs until the foundation itself begins to buckle. Anniston teaches us that when a community, a city, or an entire regional economy hitches its existence to the volatile chariot of war, the eventual peace is not a relief, it is a reckoning. In the silence of the boneyard, there is a lesson for the modern world. Every industrial empire, no matter how vast or invincible it appears at its peak, is merely a temporary arrangement of steel and human labor. The tanks at Anniston were not just machines, they were the physical embodiment of a specific moment of human fear and conviction. Now that the fear has dissipated, the machines are nothing more than heavy, toxic weight. We often speak of the end of an industry as a moment in time, but Anniston shows us that it is a process of slow, agonizing erosion. It is the steady hum of machines dying, the gradual thinning of the workforce, and the quiet acceptance of a future that no longer requires your best efforts. Yet, even in this decline, there is a stubborn, resilient human dignity that refuses to vanish. The workers of Anniston did not choose the end of the Cold War, nor did they choose the toxic legacy left in their soil. They simply endured, held their ground, and continued to carry the heavy weight of their own history long after the rest of the world had moved on. As we look at these rusting hulls, we must ask ourselves what we are building today, and at what cost to the land and the people we are leaving behind for the next generation. If this story has resonated with you, consider subscribing to follow our exploration of the industrial empires that shaped our world. Your comments on how we should treat these vanishing sites of history are always welcome.